Harriet Tubman, a brave slave who was under the torture of her owner, later made a great escape. Once she was free, she decided to devote her life to helping hundreds of other slaves to freedom. Harriet Tubman took a stand against slavery and was one of the main conductors of the Underground Railroad. She became an iconic figure in history for the dangers she faced, risking her life, leading slaves to freedom, spying for the Union during the Civil War, and fighting for women's rights after the slaves were emancipated by the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution. She encouraged others to take a stand for what they believed in.
Harriet Tubman was born into slavery in Maryland in about 1822. Her birth name was Arminta, but her nickname was Minty. At the age of 5, her family was taken away from her, and she was sold to a cruel master. Throughout her slave life, she was put through many beatings. One time, when she was at a store for her owner, the store owner threw an iron weight at a runaway slave, but accidentally hit Harriet, giving her a major injury to the head. People thought she had epilepsy, and from then on her life changed. She would always have massive headaches, and would randomly fall asleep during everyday chores, and would have hallucinations of the future. These were some of the major things that encouraged her to take a stand against slavery. She realized what she was set out to do, and no one was going to stop her.
White slave owners, or non-abolitionists, believe God created blacks to be inferior to whites. There was slavery in America since the 17th century. In the 1830s, 2 million people were slaves in America, out of a population of 12 million. Slaves lived in quarters not too far away from their master's mansion. There was about 4 families to a quarter, even though they were meant for 2. They had to keep working from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. Many of them died of overwork, starvation, and dehydration, and never got a break until nighttime. Most slaves would be separated from their loved ones, and if they didn't do exactly what they were told, they would get beaten until there were hundreds of scars on their bodies. The slaves soon had enough of this torture, so they started a revolt. A slave named William Turner led a rebellion that lasted 36 hours. 57 slaves were stabbed, and 80 to 100 whites were butchered.
There were many people who would do anything to get slaves to freedom. These people were called abolitionists. They would give runaway slaves a place to stay, rest, get cleaned up, and eat. Along with Harriet, Frederick Douglass was a leading abolitionist and anti-slave campaigner. Douglass was the son of a black slave mother and a white father. 2 of them were born into slavery, escaped, then helped each other get slaves to freedom. Harriet once proudly pointed out to Frederick Douglass she never lost a single passenger. She helped about 300 slaves get to the Promised Land. She even led some past the border into Canada.
Abolitionists' houses had a special lantern that showed the slaves that it was a safe place to stop and get help. Conductors helped the slaves get from station to station by directing them where they needed to go next and helping them keep safe and hidden. Since slaves were illiterate, conductors would write down the letters of a sign that they would need to get to their next stop. Stations consisted of hiding places in people's homes and businesses, such as barns, cellars, attics, and secret rooms. Spiritual songs were another way of communicating where to go. Guards surrounding slaves wouldn't suspect anything was going on. They thought the singing was the slaves' way of being joyful and happy. The escapees on the Underground Railroad traveled by foot, on small boats, or in covered wagons. Some were even shipped in boxes by rail or sea. The most heavily used routes were through Indiana, Ohio, and western Pennsylvania.
It was important for runaways to travel quietly under the darkness of night. The journey to freedom would take about 6 weeks or 800 miles, but struggles along the way would set runaways back. If a baby was on the trip, Harriet knew herbs that would keep them from crying. She made connections that helped her smuggle hundreds of slaves into freedom. Sometimes when the slaves had to ride on boats, it would take a long time because they tried to avoid paddling. They believed that paddling would make too much noise. It didn't matter how long it took or what she had to do. Harriet would risk her life to make sure other slaves got to be free like she was. Harriet once said she would shoot a man before he was able to turn back because she wasn't going to risk hundreds of people's lives just because of one man.
The Fugitive Slave Bill of 1850 was passed by the United States Congress on September 18th. It said that all escaped slaves were upon capture to be returned to their masters and that officials of the citizens of free states had to cooperate in this law. The North wasn't safe for runaways anymore, But in Canada, slavery was abolished. There were a few regions that would accept fugitive slaves. St. Catharines in Ontario, Canada, was a community that accepted them. Once they got to Canada, they were free. The abolitionists helped them with food, shelter, and protection while they were getting settled in their new environment.
Many supporters of Harriet Tubman during her Underground Railroad years were involved in the women's rights movement. Tubman believed in the equality of all people, black or white, male or female. Tubman's role in the women's rights movement was not that of a leader, but of a strong supporter. As a woman who fought for her own freedom and freedom of others, Tubman set to work with her friends by touring and giving speeches about her own experiences as a female slave and as a liberator of hundreds born under the bondage of slavery. She described her years as Moses and the impact she had to those who founded freedom. She toured New York, Boston, and Washington, speaking in favor of women's suffrage rights. Harriet Tubman was especially interested in the rights of African American women. In 1896, when she was already weak, she was invited as a guest speaker at the first meeting of the National Association of Colored Women. Despite being illiterate, Tubman's speeches were popular and always left people wanting more. Women's suffrage in the U.S. was finally achieved in 1920 with the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, 7 years after Harriet Tubman died.
Harriet was a very hard-working woman who used her abilities to help the Union Army during the Civil War. She was a nurse, a cook, and a spy for the Union. She served as a guerrilla operative, leading successful raids behind enemy lines. She also established networks in different communities to supply Union forces with information concerning troop placements, supply lines, and fortifications. As a nurse, she introduced a variety of herbal and holistic remedies to ailing soldiers, often curing what could have been fatal infections and diseases. After the war, Harriet received an $8 a month pension as the widow of a Civil War veteran. It wasn't until 1899 that Congress increased her pension to $25 a month for her service in the Union. She was the first African American woman to receive a military pension.
In Harriet's later years, she dedicated her life to helping the elderly, disabled, and the poor. Because she was so committed to it, she purchased 25 acres in Auburn, New York. The Harriet Tubman Home for Indigent Colored People was founded in 1903 and formally opened in 1908. When Harriet grew old, she used the home for herself. The home was deeded to the AME Zion Church when she was too old to take care of the house herself. Today is the Harriet Tubman Historical National Park.
In a letter Frederick Douglass wrote to Harriet, he said, "The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witness of your devotion to freedom and of your heroism. I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than you have. Much that you have done would seem improbable to those who do not know you as I know you. It is to me a great pleasure and a great privilege to bear testimony to your character and your works, and to say to those to whom you may come that I regard you in every way truthful and trustworthy." Douglass was truly touched by Harriet's actions and her stand against slavery, which served as an inspiration to him and many other abolitionists and civil rights leaders. Harriet Tubman was a strong woman, often doing the work of men.
She was committed to her dream of freedom, equal rights, and helping people in need, devoting her entire life to these ideals. She was brave, strong, and courageous.